Welcome to presentation 31 in our series where we're looking at the Gospel recorded by Matthew. This focuses on the destruction of the Jewish temple. Just reflecting back for a moment or two, the previous chapter finishes that way. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. As the fall of everything. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the only way back. This is a cry of anguish from Jesus. What could have been? What God wanted it to be, the people of God. But the leaders rejected it, and the doom of the nation was sealed. Jesus was looking out on the corrupted system in the nation, and he'd taken it on with great courage in Jerusalem. And this is a cry of anguish. What might have been, but tragically, what was going to be. And he now moves on in chapter 24 to describe the events that would lead up to the total destruction of the magnificent Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And the nation would be destroyed. And history shows it all happened. Now we have a problem. We have to acknowledge that chapter 24 of Matthew is a source of great misunderstanding. And all kinds of dogmatic statements are made that can lead us to great confusion. So we come to this with a bit of care and trepidation. We have somehow to disentangle what people are saying, traditional views, and these tend to be based by just ripping a verse out of context. And the way I'm going to tackle this is to look at a logical analysis of what Jesus actually taught, what he said, particularly how it would have been understood by that group of disciples in the first century. That gives us the key. That gives us the clue. But it may be that as I unfold this and give you the evidence, and it's all based on evidence, you may find that views that you thought were correct are undermined and challenged. Going to look at a fair chunk of this chapter. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came to him to call his attention to its buildings. They were magnificent. Do you see all these things? Jesus asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Now this temple building was truly majestic, a work, a feat of engineering. Nothing is left today. But some of the foundation stones are 5 meters long. How on earth did they build this? As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They're referring to the destruction of the temple. Seemed impossible that this building could be flattened. Jesus answered, Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come on my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Now that's the birth pains of the destruction of the temple. And the language, as we shall see, confirms that. Going on, then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. Much of that is misunderstood. But he's talking to a group of close followers. When he says you, it's addressed to them. This is going to be their experience. And history shows it's all true. How do we understand that sentence? Now we'll look at that in a moment. Just let's hang on to that and we'll come back to that. And I'll show you that cannot mean, does not mean, could never mean any reference to the return of Jesus. Going on, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight, that's the disciples, will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequalled from the beginning of the world till now, and never to be equalled again. Moving on. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, these days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you in advance. These days had not been cut short. We'll see that history shows that they were cut short. The actual end and the destruction of Jerusalem and the suffering of the nation was horrendous. And false messiahs and prophets came up out of the woodwork all the time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, that's the Messiah, don't go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. And in the period in the months and couple of years before the collapse of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple, there is historical records of many claiming that the Messiah is about to come. And they gave a description of where in the desert they would find him, and people were taken in. Equally, there were those who claimed that if you search in a given inner room in the temple, Messiah will suddenly appear there. And people went into these rooms to find the Messiah. Nothing happened, of course. All this came to be, and all this was fulfilled in the time just before the collapse of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple. So we have to watch that we don't rip that out of context and make it mean what we want it to mean. We'll look at the second part in a moment or two and see how that fits in. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now that's derived from two passages in Isaiah. We'll look at these in a moment because the context of these two passages is very illuminating, and it shows you what the thing actually means. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Again, that's been ripped out of context. And in fact, when we look at the language used, it's not what people think it is. That is derived, and the language shows it, from a reference to the prophecy of Daniel. And we have to look at that prophecy to see what Daniel was saying. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. We saw the events of the fig tree in the previous presentations. As soon as the twigs become tender, as leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, then you know it is near, right at the door. You'll get warning of the sacking of the temple. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. That tells us we're speaking about the collapse of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. We'll have a look at that again in a moment or two. But this whole section relates to answering the first question, which relates to the fall of Jerusalem. When will it happen? What will it be like? How will we know? Now let me just pose some questions to provoke thought. Many people claim that the chapter describes signs of the times. That's events that will happen just before Jesus returns. But if you in fact look at Matthew 24:36, Jesus himself says, "But about that day or hour," that's his return, "no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." If Jesus doesn't know when he's coming back, and he's speaking as a human being here, how dare we suggest that we can know when he's coming back? There can be no signs of the times, because that contradicts what Jesus is saying. And in Acts chapter 1, Luke records for us the words of Jesus. It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. We're stepping beyond what we should be saying and doing. The return of Jesus will come at a time nobody can predict. So there can be no signs of the time. That's an illogical absurdity. But we noted at the end of the section we just read, Jesus himself says about all that section, "Truly I tell you, this generation," that's your age group, talking to this group of young men with him, who were probably in their early 20s. There may have even been a teenager in John. "This generation will certainly not pass away." You're still going to be alive, some of you at least, until all these things have happened. And that shows us that Jesus is describing the fall of the temple. Now the keys to understanding this, and we'll look at the evidence for this now, the keys to understanding this lie in recognizing that Jesus is asked two questions. And the language that Jesus employs, or that Matthew has used to record what Jesus said, is precise. That gives us the clue. The context is this: there is the temple area. Just below it, it's on a very steep mound of rock, sticking up. A flat top is the Kidron Valley. On the other side of the Kidron Valley, there's the Mount of Olives. Now Jesus and his disciples would have come out, gone down the steep valley where the path there zigzags, you can still see it today, crossed the valley, and then up the gentle slope of the Mount of Olives. Not a great distance. So from the slope of the Mount of Olives, you can imagine Jesus with the disciples sitting on the slope, looking over at the temple area. And the disciples are utterly impressed, many of them from the north of the country, utterly impressed by the sheer grandeur of this magnificent building. So there's the description. Now when we can imagine that situation, looking across at that magnificent building, the disciples pointing it out to Jesus, and then Jesus comes as a bolt out of the blue. Do you see all these things? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. This was the center point of the Jewish nation. The whole temple worship system was the central point of Judaism. Imagine the devastating effect of that statement on that group of young men. Not one stone will be left on another. History shows that happened in AD 70. The Romans demolished the lot, leaving only the foundation blocks. Now, words are important. We've got to think of the word end. Such a simple word in English. But in the language of the New Testament, there's more than one word for end. Coming, another simple English word. In the language of the New Testament, there is more than one word that signifies coming. And what gives the key to the whole passage is this. Throughout the New Testament, when it refers to the coming of Jesus, we call it his return, one specific word is used. And it's the word that's used, if you like, in the Roman context, of an emperor coming to his people to be accepted and welcomed by his people. That's the word that's used, and you can see why that makes complete sense. The coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus, welcomed by his people. Now there's a specific word. It's not the normal word for coming. Similarly, there's more than one word for end. And when the New Testament refers to the end of the age, when Jesus returns, the end of everything, one specific word is always used. And again, it's not the normal word that would be used. It's a word that signifies the end, meaning total completion. Whereas you can have the end of all sorts of things, which is just a stage in a process. And there are other words that describe that. Words are important. So let's look at this. At the start, he's speaking to a small group, not a crowd now. He's speaking about this, the destruction of the temple. But these words are the specific words that relate to the coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus, and the winding up, the total end of everything. Now remember, the disciples are speaking here. Now they were at a confusion in their mind. They saw the signs of the coming of Jesus and the end of the age as being the same as the collapse of the temple. The temple was so important, the whole life of the nation, the people of God, they couldn't see how, if the temple wasn't there, how this wasn't the end of everything. They'd got it wrong. You see, they assumed that the destruction of the temple would mean the end of everything. They didn't understand the nature of Messiah, the suffering servant. They were wrong. Their assumption was wrong. And Jesus corrects them. Two questions were therefore asked. One relates to the destruction of the temple, and one relates to the coming of Jesus. And in his answer, Jesus separates the two questions completely. And when we look at the words that are used, it is absolutely obvious. There is no doubt about it. In simple terms, the first 35 verses refer to the sacking of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem, which is nothing to do with the return of Jesus, and Jesus stressing that. He then changes his language, and verse 36 right through to the end of chapter 25, there's the return of Jesus, his coming back, and then the events that will follow it. Now if we remember that and grasp that, it all drops into place, and the confusion starts to just disappear in our minds. It really is very straightforward. But over the years, ideas have got accumulated in Christian teaching that are simply wrong. The point that Jesus is making here, because we're going to look at the first 35 verses, is that the destruction of the Jewish nation, the destruction of the religious system, the destruction of the temple, cataclysmic though they were, are unrelated to the return of Jesus and the end of the age. And history shows that's right. And he's trying to sort out the confusion in the minds of his close followers. So the things are unrelated. And he's saying, don't be fooled. There's going to be terrible things going to happen. Don't be fooled. Nothing to do with the return of Jesus. Lots of people come as messiahs. History shows many claim to be messiahs. Wars and rumours of wars. The period between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus and the collapse of Jerusalem was a period of frequent wars, frequent uprisings, frequent revolts, most of them in the Palestine area. And indeed there was civil war in Rome in AD 68 to 69. These things are happening. They're nothing to do with my return. There were famines and earthquakes. History shows us there were numerous earthquakes in the period from AD 30 to 70. And there was a widespread famine in AD 46. Nothing to do with the return of Jesus. History shows the followers of Jesus were hated, and it grew and grew until in the 60s AD, the hatred of the followers of Jesus came to a peak under Emperor Nero. Many lost their lives under the most brutal and cruel circumstances, and some couldn't take it. It's true that the followers of Jesus were betrayed. We just have to look at the history of the period running up to AD 70. It's true that there were many people who claimed to be prophets. All that happened. And people looked out in the Roman Empire, and in particularly in the Palestine area, the wider Middle Eastern area, wickedness just seemed to be taking over. The sheer evil that was going on, and the destruction, the wanton destruction of lives of the followers of Jesus. Nothing to do with his return. But how do we interpret that one? That little phrase there is very misleading. That phrase is usually used of the Roman world. Now, the good news of the kingdom of Jesus was proclaimed throughout the Roman Empire between AD 30 and 70. It spread like wildfire all over the place, all over the nations, all over the groups that Rome had conquered. And that word refers to the non-Jews. The kingdom of Jesus went beyond the Jewish nation. It went all over the place to all people groups. The disciples had difficulty coming to terms with that. But the key thing is that word there. Because it's not the special word that's always used to speak of the end of the age and the return of Jesus. The end is the end of the temple. It's not the end of the age. It's not the return of Jesus. That word gives us the clue. If you look at a text, you can get any meaning out of it if you ignore what it actually says. That's what it says. The good news of the kingdom will be all over the Roman Empire, all over all the people groups. That's true, it happened. The fall of Jerusalem then happened in AD 70. If you got this picture going back to Daniel, in the 2nd century BC, there was a pagan worship center set up on the Temple Mount, which Jewish people then got rid of. So the picture there is this going to happen again. Now, having got rid of things that are nothing to do with the return of Jesus, but they're just going to happen, and they're going to happen before the temple's destroyed, Jesus now focuses on the actual specific signs of the temple destruction, one of which was the setting up of pagan worship on the Temple Mount, idolatry in the temple precinct. That's what Daniel refers to, and that's what happened in the 2nd century BC. It's going to happen again. And Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by armies. Now, both of these happened before the fall of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple. And the advice, when you see these things, get out. Run for your lives. It's your only chance of survival. And history shows us that many Christians remembered the words of Jesus and did precisely that and saved their lives. Now, actually, what happened? What was the history? There was a Jewish revolt. There'd been a whole series of little rumblings and wars and rebellions going on, just as Jesus predicted. It was quickly crushed by Vespasian, the army commander, and much of the land was conquered. Then there was serious unrest in Rome, so the Palestine campaign under Vespasian was suspended temporarily, and some of the Christians escaped. History shows it. Now, a group known as Zealots then occupied the temple area during that suspension. Now, Zealots were the kind of, if you like, the equivalent of terrorists under the banner of Judaism, not religious. And there was all sorts of factional fighting in the temple sanctuary area, which was the bringing in of idolatry. A kind of civil war. Now, the Roman attack resumed, and everything except the key fortresses were captured. Now there was a break again. Vespasian was summoned back to Rome. He was made emperor. Temporary break in hostilities. And history shows us, when he got taken away, many of the Christians who had remained now escaped finally, following the instructions of Jesus. His son Titus takes over. A 5-month siege, quite short. The city was starved out. Shouldn't have been starved out, but it was starved out because the Zealots burned the food supplies. Height of lunacy, but it would have lasted for 2 or 3 years if they hadn't done that. That's the reference of it being mercifully short. It was horrendous. People starved to death. Children suffered the most horrendous experiences. Round Jerusalem were the eagle banners of Rome, and then they were eventually raised in the ruined site of the temple. The city was destroyed, the temple was flattened exactly as Jesus said, not one stone left on another, and all the valuable things were taken to Rome. That's what actually happened in history, and Jesus has described it with great accuracy. Historians record it was one of the most brutal of the Roman wars. That's what is claimed. Horrendous. Hundreds of thousands of men were crucified, dying in torture all over the land. The nation was ripped apart. That siege at the end was mercifully short, as Jesus predicted. But the women and children were brutalized in the most horrendous way. No wonder the disciples, those who were still alive at the time, would think this was the end of the age and Jesus about to return, but it wasn't. The age has never ended yet. And later a temple to Zeus, the Roman god, was put in the mount, and then the first mosque in the 630s, a wooden mosque, was built, today replaced by the magnificent Dome of the Rock. Now let's look at the key points from this. It's not the end of the age, nothing to do with it. When you see the signs, that was the lull in the fighting, the Roman armies around the place, temple idolatry, get out. It's the final end. And there is no prediction that the temple religious system will ever be restored. If it was going to be restored, surely Jesus would have said so. There is no prediction that the Jewish nation will ever be restored. If that was to be important in the economy of God's plan, Jesus would have said it. He doesn't. Because the replacement temple is Jesus himself. Jesus is vindicated totally. The prophecy came true exactly as he said. He never predicted it would be easy for his followers. He was warning them what to do so they'll understand it. We should be informed and prepared. But he was speaking to that early group of disciples. False messiahs and prophets. All of this just happened. History records it. People pointed to the desert. They pointed to inner rooms in the temple area. This was during the time of the siege, or just before it. What Jesus is saying there is, when I return, everyone will see it. It's going to be totally different. Don't listen to any of these claims. None of them are true. They're all false. The return of Jesus will be totally different from anything that's related to the fall of Jerusalem and the events that happened just before it. The whole world will see it, and the word coming there is the specific word. You could summarize it that way, and that's what the point Jesus is making. The fall of Jerusalem will be terrible. It was. It was perhaps the worst Roman campaign ever conducted by the Roman Empire in its history. The sheer brutality. They'd had enough of this nation. No matter how terrible it is, it's nothing to do with my return. When I come back, all humanity will know it. That's the point Jesus is making. Oh, people have argued about this. Is it vultures? Is it eagles? In fact, the word can mean either. They weren't biologically able to understand the differences so clearly as we do today. Because you see, eagles live in live prey and vultures live in dead prey. Oh, so what? From a distance, they don't look that different. But the word carcass tells us that the meaning here is vultures, because eagles do not feed on a carcass. They only eat live prey. The leadership in Jerusalem in the temple area destroyed itself, and all the Romans did was wipe out the carcass that was already dead. That's the significance of that statement. Now the last section, it's very common to hear people speaking about this as the return of Jesus. I'm going to show, as Bible commentators who look at the real text and there is no language show, that that is impossible. Don't feel uncomfortable, just come with me. Look at the evidence that's presented. Verse 29 of that section starts, immediately after the distress of those days. Now that's clearly the fall of Jerusalem, sacking of the temple, and the horrendous suffering of the people. But the word is immediately, and immediately means immediately. Jesus has not returned. If you look at verse 34, the section concludes with the statement, "This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." In other words, your generation, people of your age, there'll still be some alive. It's going to happen during your lifetime, and that's true. Yes, some of the early group of followers of Jesus were executed. James was perhaps the first. Some lived long after the events, like John. But that age group, it was going to happen in their lifetime. Jesus speaking somewhere round about AD 30. It happened in the late 60s and was finished by AD 70. But there's further evidence. Let's go back to that picture there. Immediately after the distress of those days, now there's a picture of things to do with sun, moon, stars, and heavenly bodies. And people have come up with all sorts of amazing interpretations of this. We've got to go back and look where it's quoted from. Now Isaiah uses these phrases, they're kind of combined here. One refers to the destiny of the Babylonian Empire when it fell, and the other refers to the nation of Edom, to the southeast of Judah, when it fell. Both these events had long happened, and when they happened there were no cosmic events related to either. This is not a literalism. It means something completely different. Now let me just put up another quotation. This describes the fall of Jerusalem. Contending hosts were seen meeting in the skies. Arms flashed. Suddenly the temple was illumined with fire from the clouds. Of a sudden the doors of the shrine opened and a superhuman voice cried, "The gods are departing." At the same time the mighty stir of their going was heard. That describes the collapse of the temple and its destruction. And that was written by Tacitus, the Roman historian, who saw the events of the time, and he was no friend of either Jews or Christians. That's the language he used, and that's the same language that Isaiah used. We've got to interpret in terms of the context of the language. He's talking about spiritual cosmic events. The temple system, its collapse and destruction, was a spiritual cosmic event. The vindication and growth of the kingdom of God was a spiritual cosmic event. And the Old Testament prophets speak of cosmic collapse. They use the language, it's poetic language, to speak of great spiritual cosmic events, things that are of massive importance in the whole history and destiny of this planet. And they symbolize God's act of judgment within history. The prophets always speak within history. And there are catastrophic political reversals that come out of this, whether it's the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, the wipeout of the nation of Edom, or the collapse of the temple. Changes the whole way history is going. Spiritual cosmic events with political reversals. That's the meaning of it. But now about this bit. And people have taken this and say, well, when Jesus returns, he's going to come on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. There'll be angels and all the people who followed him will be gathered together. That's not what it says when you look under the surface. First of all, it's based on Daniel. You can tell from the language. That's what Daniel said. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. That's where the phrase comes from. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Son of Man, phrase always used of Jesus, speaks of Jesus, representative Israel, doing what Israel failed to do as a nation group. Could be representative humanity in a sense as well. That's always God. But you see, Jesus was led into God's presence. He's presented to God. He has won the victory. He has given authority over the world. His kingdom will never be destroyed. The kingdom now was a separate entity. It grew out of Judaism. It's now on its own, and it's going to grow. It'll never be destroyed, and it's still growing today at a great rate. You see, we've got things round by 180 degrees. We think this is Jesus coming from heaven. Daniel is referring to Jesus coming into God's presence, was led into his presence. This is all that Jesus had achieved, coming to its completion. So let's go back to the passage with that in mind. Now the disciples would have got that immediately because Daniel at that time was such an important prophet in Jewish thought. But you see, coming is not the right word for the return of Jesus. That just confirms it. The disciples would have been under no illusions. Coming on the clouds of heaven was Jesus, his job completed, going back into heaven. And indeed the fall of Jerusalem vindicated, justified all that Jesus said and did, and the establishment of his kingdom. It's nothing to do with the return of Jesus. And indeed, that phrase, people of the land, the tribes of the land, is a better interpretation and translation, and some modern translations use that. When you look at the original, and that phrase always means the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, the whole Jewish system of religion had collapsed in a pile of dust as the temple had been sacked and the nation had been destroyed, tragically, just as Jesus had predicted. He didn't want that, but their leaders wouldn't come and listen to Jesus. That was the inevitable consequence. It blew itself apart, and the Romans cleaned up the mess. And there was mourning, and there's been mourning amongst the Jewish people in a sense ever since. But that's a picture which, again, you've got to take in the context of what prophetic background and the phrases that prophets have used from the Old Testament. That's a picture of the kingdom growing rapidly. Now, if you do simple mathematical calculations on the growth of the number of followers of Jesus across the Roman Empire in the first 200-300 years, it is a fantastic growth. It would not be an exaggeration to say an exponential growth. Jesus was calling people together. His kingdom was growing at a phenomenal rate, and the rate of growth was only stopped when politics and religion combined and Christendom was formed. A disastrous mistake. And it came from all over the Roman Empire. That's what Jesus is referring to. And if we look at the language that he actually uses, it's clear. But it's nothing to do with the return of Jesus. And the thing that's the crunch piece of evidence is the wrong word is used for coming. What Jesus is saying is, just like Daniel's vision, the loss of one power structure opens the way for another. The Jewish nation and Jewish people very often hindered the growth of the kingdom in the early stages. That resistance was now gone. Jesus presented to the world as Lord of all. What he said came true. What he did worked. He's won the victory. His cross and resurrection now have meaning. And his kingdom will never be destroyed. We humans have made a right mess of it at times over history. But his kingdom is still growing today, and growing at an enormous rate in many parts of the world today, where they're living faithful to what he said and did. And there's a message there for us in the West where things are not so good. In summary, the temple system was destroyed. The new temple is Jesus. That's the replacement, not a building. There was an ingathering of God's people in the 30-40 years between the death of Jesus and his resurrection and the sacking of Jerusalem. A new age was being inaugurated. It was a spiritual cataclysmic event. And Jesus given the authority, the kingdom, all authority, as he said when he ascended. But now the kingdom of Jesus was totally inclusive. It went way beyond the original people of God of the Jewish nation. And it spilled out right across the Roman Empire. That's what he's saying to his disciples. They asked the question, when will it happen? In your lifetime. It'll be horrendous. But when you see certain things happening, flee, get out fast. It's your only hope. The entire religious system will be wiped out forever. And people will see that all I said and did was true. The victory over all forces of evil has been achieved. That was achieved at the cross, vindicated in the resurrection, now demonstrated publicly. And the kingdom of God will be established, was being established and spreading rapidly. It's nothing to do with the end of the age. Nothing to do with my return. Jesus is not speaking about the end of the age. He's not speaking about his return. He's speaking about the fall of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple. And they're completely different from his return. And when he does return, and he uses the correct word here, it'll be seen by all humanity. That's the key messages for his disciples about the destruction of the temple. Having separated the questions, we've looked at the answer to the first one. Jesus now changes his language and answers the second question about his return. And we'll start looking at that in the next presentation.